Hello, I'm Chief Kevin Foster of the Norman Police Department. I want to thank you for taking time to watch a short video about the state of the Norman Police Department. Over the last couple of years, we have heard a lot of things said about the Norman Police Department. Several things we have heard about the department are very misleading, either from a lack of knowledge or to intentionally mislead the community. Regardless of what the issue is, we have decided to start a State of the Department presentation each year. Our hope is that this presentation, as well as future presentations, will help you better understand your department, the crime in your community, traffic issues in your community, and where the department is heading. Here you see the topics we'll cover in this presentation. We will start off with staffing, moving to crime in the community, and then to traffic. And toward the end, we'll cover the changes that have happened at the department during 2021. The public safety sales tax is one thing that I believe several people know little about. We're going to try to explain a little of the history and where it is currently. First, it is important to understand that prior to any public safety sales tax being passed by the voters, the police department had 135 commissioned police officers and 55 non-commissioned positions, all funded by the general fund. In 2008, the citizens approved what has become known as the PSST 1, or the Public Safety Sales Tax 1. This was a temporary tax to add 41 commissioned police officers to the police department. As you can see in bullet point 3, the plan was to add 12 officers the first year, and then 9, 9, 5, 2, 2, and 2 the following years, for a total of 41 new additional officers by 2015. Then in 2014, the City Council decided to ask voters to make the public safety sales tax permanent. The city stated that this would permanently retain the 41 additional police officers added by PSST 1 and add an additional 13 police officers that would be assigned to work our schools. This vote and the additional 13 officers became known as the PSST 2, and it was passed by the voters also. Then in 2020, City Council voted to cut $865,000 from the proposed police budget. And remember that around 83% of our budget is salaries and benefits. And two large pieces of this was cut directly from salaries and benefits. This cut resulted in the loss of 9 police officer positions. During the time just prior to this, there had been a hiring freeze, and we were waiting for the okay to fill 7 vacant positions we had at that time. Now, we have heard some say all 9 positions that were cut were vacant at the time, but that is not true. We only had 7 vacancies when this was done. Luckily, the city manager allowed us to overhire by the 2 until we accounted for all 9 positions through attrition. This slide shows us the staffing levels of commissioned police officers we would be at if all positions promised in PSST 1 and PSST 2 were added to our original staffing in 2007. The first line is the staffing levels funded by the general fund in 2007. So 135, prior to any public safety sales tax being passed. The second line is the 41 police officers that were added by PSST 1 and made permanent by PSST 2. The third line is the additional 13 police officers added by PSST 2 to work in our schools. Then we see in line 4 that if all the police officers were added, we would be at an authorized staffing level of 189 commissioned police officers. Here we're looking at the commissioned police officer positions budgeted for in the current fiscal year. The top line reminds us that prior to any PSST, we had 135 positions funded from the general fund. The second line shows us how many police officer positions are funded in the current general fund budget, followed with the number of officers funded by the PSST fund for the current year budget. So general fund is currently paying for 121 police officers, and the PSST fund is paying for 50 police officers, for the total current authorized police officers allowed by the budget of 171. Now this shows us that there are 14 fewer positions funded by the general fund than there were in 2007 before any PSST. This is important because there seems to be a lot of focus on an interfund transfer from the general fund to the PSST fund. We'll look at that here. Now, while it's always been known that the general fund would end up supplementing the PSST, there's been a lot of focus on this supplement funding happening a little sooner than expected. The first bullet point here shows the transfer made this budget year from the general fund to the PSST fund. This is done because there is a lack of funds in the PSST to cover the cost of the 50 positions. However, note from the last slide that there are currently 14 less positions funded by the general fund this year than were funded in 2007, before any PSST vote. If these 14 positions were restored to the general fund and subtracted from the PSST, there would be no need for the transfer from the general fund this year. The way I've gotten this is I take the 9 positions that were defunded in 2020 and divide that into the $865,000, which is the dollar amount cut in 2020, and that comes to $96,111 per position. And if you take that $96,111 per position and multiply it by the 14 positions that the general fund no longer funds, it comes to $1,345,555. By putting those pre-PSST positions back in the general fund, we would give the PSST a positive balance for this budget year. Now, I want to mention that the PSST also pays a debt service each year, and this is for bonds that were sold to do various public safety projects. These PSST bonds should pay off in 2027. At that time, the payment from the PSST fund to debt service will no longer be needed. This would save the PSST fund over $2,369,000 a year. Now, when we look at projections in the current year's budget book, the projected transfer from the general fund to PSST in fiscal year 2026 is $2,288,527. So with these projections, after the debt service pays off in 2027, the PSST would be much closer to being balanced, or at least there wouldn't be need to be near the supplement made from the general fund. Now, before June of 2020, our authorized commission positions was 180 police officers. After the council reduced the proposed budget for the department in 2020, this left our authorized staffing at 171 police officers. This slide shows the actual officers we have available for assignment in the Norman Police Department. The first bullet point shows our current authorized commissioned police officer positions of 171. The second line is the number of vacancies we currently have, which is 8. We recently, at the first of this week, brought in a new lateral, which reduced us. We had 9 until the first of this week vacancies, but we was able to fill one of them with a lateral from another agency. So the 171 minus the current vacancies leaves us with 163 police officer positions. Below the line showing the 163 officers, we have included officers that are out for on-the-job injuries, that are out for long-term sick or FMLA leave, like maybe the birth of a child or an injury that didn't occur on duty. Those out on military leave, which that fluctuates throughout the year. And then those that are still in training and not available for assignment. This leaves us with 147 police officers available for assignment. And this doesn't count the numbers that may be sick that day, that calls in sick that day, or is away due to quarantine because of COVID exposure. The sad thing is we also believe that there's an additional 6 to 10 officers currently exploring other opportunities. So we could lose another 6 to 10 within the next 6 months. That will even make it worse. Now I'd like to sort of tell you, like the hiring process, trying to get these officers back and get our staffing back up will take time. The hiring process itself, just to get applications, do the backgrounds, do everything we do to bring somebody on, takes 4 to 6 months. And then the training will take an additional 7 to 11 months, depending on if there's prior law enforcement or if they need to go through our full academy. So we are out a year from the time we start the hiring process until the officers are on the street available for assignment. So that's how long it'll take us to recover officers. And that's if we can recruit them, which we'll talk about recruiting here in just a little bit. Staffing needs. I am frequently asked how many officers our department needs. And I normally reply that I believe we need 200 or more officers for a city our size. Now, there are different ways to compute officers needed to handle the responsibilities of a police department, but a common quick method is to look at officers per 1,000 residents. This slide is showing how we compare to benchmark cities that we compare with from across the nation and where we fall within those benchmarks. We compare with 29 other cities from around the country that are similar to us, and this is called our Benchmark City Survey. We have done this comparison for over 20 years. And you can see in the third bullet point that the average officers per 1,000 residents is 1.45 officers per 1,000. Now, I also looked up our most recent census data that I could find for Norman. And what I found was our population is now just over 128,000. Now, if our agency was just going to be average among our benchmark cities, this would put us having 186 police officers. However, this is not taking into account the size of the jurisdiction. We cover nearly 190 square miles. So let's take a look at that and how we compare to benchmarks. When we look at the benchmark cities' geographical areas they cover, Norman has 80 plus square miles more than 27 of the 29 cities in the study. We had 100 or more square miles more than 22 of the cities, and over 150 more square miles than 7 of the cities. What I'm getting at is that we have considerably more miles to cover than most of our benchmark cities. I think it is very reasonable to add at least 3 more officers to patrol the additional 80 plus square miles that we have, both to provide the patrol for those citizens that they deserve and for officer safety, to have a backing officer within a reasonable distance when an officer needs a back. To do this 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, we would add 15 more officers. And the way this is takes 5 officers for each position to cover 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So the 5 for each position times the 3 is 15 more positions. So if you were to have the average number of officers in the benchmark survey and add this 15 officers to cover our jurisdiction in a reasonable manner, this would put us at 201 officers. As you can see there in the last bullet point, I think we should be above average with at least 1.5 officers per 1,000 residents, which would bring our staffing levels to 207 police officers. Now in the slides to follow, we will look at the benchmark city data, the actual data, and we'll look at the national picture and see what it looks like on officers per 1,000 residents. This slide shows us the square miles of our benchmark cities that we've talked about, along with the names of some of the cities that we are comparing to. You can see that Norman is the second largest jurisdiction in the benchmark survey, and that we are considerably larger than most of the other jurisdictions. You can see us all the way to the right. I've highlighted us down there at the bottom. This slide shows the officers per 1,000 residents that we talked about earlier for our benchmark cities. You can also see the average highlighted on this chart, which is the 1.4 officers per 1,000 residents that I mentioned in the prior slides. You can also see that Norman is currently at 1.39 officers per 1,000 residents. If we were to move to the 1.45, as said earlier, this would put our staffing at 186 officers, not taking into account the additional square miles that we cover here in Norman. Now, some will base the officers needed on the calls per service per officer. So I wanted to show you where Norman has been in the benchmark cities comparison on calls per service per officer. On this slide, you can see the average calls per service highlighted at the top of the chart for the calls for service per officer, which is 287. Actually, on there it shows 287.2. In the chart, you see Norman's number highlighted for 2020, which is 363 calls per officer. This is well above the average and toward the top of all cities. However, you can see that 2020 was an odd year and that everybody's calls for service dropped. So if we look at 2019, which is the red line on this chart, you can see Norman would be at the top of the benchmark cities on calls per officer, with over 500 calls per officer. I wanted to point this out because I want you to understand, I'm not trying to inflate what is needed in our community. I just want to have enough officers to provide the service that is expected and to provide for the safety, not only of our community, but of the officers that are out there. I want our officers to always have a backing officer available when needed within a reasonable distance. This slide is showing some information from the U.S. Department of Justice, FBI Information Services Division about the average officers per 1,000 residents in 2019. 2019 is the most recent data I could find, or maybe more current, but I didn't find it. I've highlighted the summary at the bottom of this page, and I know it's hard to see and you may not be able to read it, but I'm going to tell you what it says. This shows the national rate of officers per 1,000 residents is 2.4 in 2019. If we were meeting this average, we would need over 307 police officers. Again, I wanted to show I'm not trying to exaggerate the officers needed for Norman. I'm using benchmark cities we have compared to for years to come up with a reasonable number of officers for our jurisdiction. This also shows the total number of police personnel, meaning that it's all your civilian personnel and all the commissioned officers added together per 1,000 residents. So all police personnel per 1,000 residents. And it shows that the average for our country is 3.5. Currently, the Norman Police Department is at 1.89 employees per 1,000 residents. Now that you have an understanding of the number of officers we need, I want to explain the difficulties we are having recruiting people to come to work for our agency and some of the possible reasons. The most basic hurdle for us to overcome is the pay. There are several agencies in the metro area paying their officers better with better benefits. We have had potential recruits tell us, after hearing our pay, that they were just going to wait for another agency in the metro to open their process. Now, the pay seems to be a factor around the nation, really. It's hard to recruit everywhere. People that may want to work in this profession feel that the pay is too little for the risk and the scrutinies police officers are put under. However, recruiting in our area is exacerbated by the pay scale for the Norman officers compared to metro agencies right here where we're trying to recruit. When people's looking at this area, they're comparing the agencies that's right here around you if they're looking to move here. The second difficulty in recruiting is the stress of the job, and not just the risk and the danger, but the scrutiny, as I mentioned before, the scrutiny police officers are put under today. The third that I've listed here, believe may affect our recruiting ability, is the lack of appreciation and support. These three issues make it very difficult to recruit the quality people the residents have come to expect here. And when I say quality people, you understand we produce quality people that people try to recruit. You know, the chief, deputy chief of Moore, the chief in Edmond, the Oklahoma County Sheriff, the Cleveland County Sheriff, and the chiefs of other agencies in Oklahoma and other states came from Norman. We have quality people here. We do quality training. So we have some of the best, and it's just what our residents have come to expect. Beyond this, one of those 9 positions that was cut in 2020 was our recruiter, because we just have to have people in patrol to take calls and, you know, investigate the crimes. And that was one piece we can move back to patrol. We also moved our traffic units back to patrol just to take the calls for service. So it's very hard recruiting today. Here, I'm just showing you the wage and benefits comparison for a few cities in the metro area. This isn't all of them, and this isn't all of them that pay more than us. And you can see for yourself where we fall within these cities that we compete with when recruiting officers. And I wanted to show you the regional comparison here too. Here, I'm just showing the wage and benefits comparison for a few cities in the region. And you can see for yourself where we fall within these cities in our region that we compete with on recruiting. Those highlighted at the top are some of our benchmark cities in the area. So you can sort of see some of the benchmark cities that we compare with there. Okay, crime data. Now, we've heard people talk about crime being up or crime being down, and we've heard the media and others talk about the rise in violent crime across the nation. And I'm sure all of them are being honest based on what they've heard or what they're looking at or whatever they're referencing. We want to show you where crime is in Norman with some comparisons to give you a perspective. I think it is important to understand the difference between Part 1 crimes and Part 2 crimes. So on this slide, we show you what we're talking about. Part 1 crime is your more serious crime, such as murder, rape, robbery. And as stated on the slide, Part 1 crimes have increased in Norman. But Part 2 crimes, which is most other crimes excluding Part 1, has decreased in Norman. And then overall, the Part 1 and Part 2 together has also increased slightly over 2020 levels. However, keep in mind that 2020 was an odd year, and probably 2021 has been affected by COVID. Here's our end-of-year crime data for Norman. You can see the increase in Part 1 crime. we have seen an increase in aggravated assaults both in 2020 and 2021 as compared to the 2019 and compared to what our 5-year average is here. Other increases we saw was in rapes, larcenies, and auto thefts. You can also see the decrease in Part 2 crimes. However, there was a significant increase in the vandalisms you can see there, which causes some concern. And you can also see that overall there was a slight increase in crime for Norman. Now, crime fluctuates year to year, and the last couple of years have been different due to COVID. But the significant increase in auto thefts and aggravated assaults and those vandalisms causes some concern for us. I'll move on to traffic. You can see here that fatality accidents for 2021 is down from 2020 numbers. However, 2020 was a very high year for fatality accidents in Norman, even with the reduced number of people out driving. However, while fatalities were down, we did see an increase in injury, non-injury, and then just overall accidents from the 2020 numbers. I worry that we could see a spike in accidents over this coming year because our enforcement has dropped off, both due to COVID, probably not wanting to make contact, and staffing issues. As we recover from COVID more and more, people would be going back to work or just getting out of their homes and out on the street more, driving. So those things, along with us seeing a jump in our injury accidents in 2021, is also concerning. The other thing, as I mentioned earlier, we've dissolved our traffic unit. Really, it shows on our org chart still, but I've had to move all those officers back to patrol just to answer calls for service and to keep our staffing levels reasonable where it's safe for the officers, where they have backing officers and things. It's just a safety issue even now. So our traffic's been moved back to patrol, so we don't have them out there. And that's another reason our contacts, as we'll look at on the next slide, have fallen off. Here you see our traffic contacts and can see the drop off in warnings and tickets for traffic violations over the past couple of years. Like I mentioned, this is partly due to COVID and partly due to staffing issues we're experiencing. I mean, they just don't have the extra time to work traffic or patrol even. They're going to calls, writing the reports. They're busy most of the time. So the time available for traffic is lower. Now, traffic contacts will be pushed this next year, but officers still have much less time to patrol and work traffic due to those call volumes. And we understand traffic accidents are our greatest social harm. They do more property damage and injure more people than most other crime. Our officers will be making every effort to do better in this coming year. Here I wanted you to see how many calls come into our communications division. It is well over 300,000 calls, or an average of over 860 calls per day. You can also see that from the calls that came into communications last year, over 84,000 of them were handled by the police department. Stunningly, over 186,000 of those calls to communications generated no call for service. But communications still had to answer those calls and either confirm it was a repeat call of one we'd already received something about, but they still had to gather additional information from that caller and put it into the incident. Or maybe it was just directing people to another agency or another place. They didn't need police, fire, EMS. It's just another department maybe, or just to answer a question. But they had to answer all those 186,000 plus calls. Over the last 20 years, 911 calls processed in our communications division has increased over 125%. But again, the the thing I really wanted to point out here is the police calls for service last year was over 84,000, or an average of over 230 calls per day, 365 days a year. Here you can see the maximum authorized staffing and communications to handle all those calls that come in, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Now, while I use the word officer here, I want to explain that these are not police officers that work on the street or could work on the street. They are trained professional civilian communications officers. Now, the minimum staffing in communications currently is 4 people. I believe that's 1 dispatcher for police, 1 fire dispatcher, and then 1 dispatcher for parking and animal welfare, and then a supervisor, or a COM3 that covers for the supervisor when they're out. Keep this in mind for the next slide, where I'll show you the effects additional staffing can have. This is 2 hailstorms from last year. On these 2 hailstorms from last year, you can see the difference staffing makes. The first storm, the one on top, was not predicted. So we were stuck with the current minimum staffing that was there, and that's the 4. You can see highlighted sort of up there in the top middle of that one. The second storm was predicted, so 2 additional communications officers were held over to help. While I did not have the admin or the 7-digit call data available for the second storm, you can see the difference just in the 911 call data. Calls handled, the numbers were very similar on the events, but the 911 calls were answered 10 seconds quicker on the second storm. Now, this may not seem like very long to you, but when you're the person on the other end of that phone needing help, it seems like an eternity. You can see on the right-hand end some other improvements. The percentage abandoned, that's the number of calls that the people hung up because we hadn't answered. They hung up before we answered. You can see it decreased from 31% to 10%. And then on the numbers that rolled over to another agency, meaning we didn't answer in so many rings, it rolls to another agency's 911 system. That went from 33 on that first storm to 1 on the second. So you can see the effects of additional staffing here, just like it would be in the field. It makes a difference. Okay, I wanted to show you the new organization, or the changes made over the last year here at the department. First, we did the reorganization that formed a new bureau that has all of our training records and community outreach under it. The second thing that has changed is our partnerships with the University of Oklahoma to assist us with our victim advocacy and in analyzing our data. And our hope is that both of these partnerships will help to make our community safer. And we look forward to continuing them. Here, I just wanted to show you the organizational chart for the department. This is an operational organizational chart. The chart that you'll see maybe if you look in the budget books and you see the organizational chart, that will look a little different because the budget book breaks the areas up by cost center rather than operational, like this organizational chart. And the center section is the newest bureau, the Community and Staff Services Bureau. And on here, you can see these 4 officers over here. Well, they're not there because that's the traffic unit that I've moved back to patrol to be able to take calls and have a safe number of officers out there. So while some may show that it's staffing is there, actually I moved someone back to patrol just because we're at a critical level here. But I just wanted you to see the new org chart that we have. Again, thank you for watching and or listening to our State of the Department address. I hope it was informative, and if you have any suggestions for next year's address, please let us know. It'd be very helpful. Again, thank you.